6, 6, 6. The most famous number in history. Say it out loud and everyone knows what you mean. The mark of the beast. The number of the Antichrist. It's been tattooed on heavy metal album covers, scrawled into horror movie scripts, whispered in conspiracy theories. Some people fear it so much they avoid addresses, phone numbers, license plates containing those digits. In 2003, when Ronald and Nancy Reagan moved to Bel Air, they changed their house number from 666 St. Cloud Road to 668. They didn't want to live at the Antichrist's address. But if you ask most people where 666 actually comes from, you'll get vague answers. The Bible, maybe. Revelation, if they paid attention in Sunday school. It's the devil's number, which isn't even technically correct. Here's what most people don't know. The number 666 is a code, a cryptogram, and if you crack it, you don't find Satan. You find a specific historical monster, a man who turned the empire into a nightmare. Here's what else most people don't know. The word Antichrist appears exactly 4 times in the Bible and never in the book of Revelation. The Antichrist isn't even the main villain of apocalyptic prophecy. He's an idea that got built, brick by brick, over 2,000 years. An idea that became history's most versatile weapon. Medieval popes used it to condemn emperors. Protestant reformers used it to condemn popes. Every generation since has found a new candidate. Napoleon, Hitler, Reagan. Yes, some people thought it was Reagan. Saddam Hussein, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Bill Gates. The list goes on and on and on. And here's the thing. They were all wrong. Every single one of them. The prophecies failed. The calculations didn't add up. The world didn't end. But that hasn't stopped the next generation from trying. Right now, somewhere, someone is rearranging the letters of a politician's name, assigning numbers to each one, and getting 666. They're convinced they figured it out. They're convinced this time is different. They're wrong too. So where did this idea come from? How did a handful of cryptic verses from ancient texts become the blueprint for identifying ultimate evil? Why have Christians spent 2 millennia accusing everyone from Muslim caliphs to microchip manufacturers of being the Antichrist? And what does the obsession with this figure reveal? Not about prophecy, but about us. This is the story of the Antichrist. Not the person, because he doesn't exist, but the idea. An idea born in the caves of Qumran, forged in the fires of Rome, weaponized in medieval power struggles, illustrated by Renaissance masters, marketed by 19th century theologians, and downloaded into 21st century conspiracy theories. By the time we're done, you'll see the Antichrist everywhere. The word Antichrist comes from Greek, Antichristos, 2 parts, anti plus Christos. But here's where it gets interesting. Most people assume anti means against. They're half right. In Greek, this prefix carries a dual meaning. It does mean against or opposite to, but it also means in place of or instead of. An opponent versus an imposter. An enemy who attacks openly versus a replacement who pretends to be you. This is critical. The Antichrist isn't just someone who opposes Christ. He's someone who counterfeits Christ, who imitates him, who performs miracles, speaks with authority, gathers followers, offers salvation. The terror of the Antichrist isn't that he's obviously evil, it's that he's convincingly good. The wolf in sheep's clothing, the false prophet who does real miracles, the liar who tells you exactly what you want to hear. Christianity's earliest theologians understood this. Irenaeus of Lyons, writing around 180 CE, described the Antichrist as the sum of all apostasy, not just an enemy of God, but a parody of God, the ultimate counterfeit. The second half of the word, Christos, is Greek for the Hebrew Mashiach, Messiah. Both mean anointed one. In ancient Israel, prophets anointed kings by pouring oil over their heads. When early Christians proclaimed Jesus as the Christ, they were making a political claim. This carpenter from Nazareth wasn't just a teacher. He was the promised anointed king. So Antichristos is the anti-anointed, the false king, the pretender to the throne. But as we mentioned earlier, the word Antichrist appears exactly 4 times in the entire Bible, and all 4 appearances are in the same set of documents. 2 short letters attributed to John, one of Jesus' apostles. Not in Daniel, not in Revelation, not in Paul's warnings about the man of lawlessness. The word shows up in 1 John and 2 John, and nowhere else. Here's what John wrote, around 90 to 100 CE. Children, it is the last hour, and as you have heard that Antichrist is coming, so now many Antichrists have come. Notice something. John uses the word 2 ways in the same sentence. The Antichrist, singular, a specific future figure, and many Antichrists, plural, false teachers already active. This dual usage has haunted Christian theology ever since. Is the Antichrist a single person who will appear at the end of time? Or is Antichrist a category that appears in every generation? John seems to say, both. A few verses later, who is the liar but he who denies that Jesus is the Christ? This is the Antichrist, he who denies the Father and the Son. 1 John 2:22. So an Antichrist is anyone who denies that Jesus is the Messiah. By this definition, the early church was surrounded by Antichrists. Gnostics who claimed Jesus was only spirit, not flesh. Jewish teachers who rejected Jesus' claims. Pagan philosophers who dismissed Christianity as superstition. But John also warns about the Antichrist as a future threat. Every spirit that does not confess Jesus, has come in the flesh, is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you heard was coming and now is in the world already. Present and future, already here and yet to come. In his second letter, many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. Such a one is the deceiver and the Antichrist. 2 John 1:7. Deceiver, liar. These are the traits John emphasizes, not military conquest, not political power, not supernatural horror, just deception. The Antichrist's primary weapon is the lie. But if the word Antichrist only appears 4 times, and only to describe deceivers and false teachers, how did it become the central figure of Christian apocalyptic imagination? Because while John used the word, he wasn't inventing a new concept. He was naming something that already existed in Jewish apocalyptic thought. Something older, something darker. And the Bible is full of descriptions of this figure, even if they don't use John's word. The answer: they took pieces from different parts of the Bible and assembled them like a puzzle. A prophecy from Daniel here, a warning from Paul there, visions from Revelation over there. None of these texts use the word Antichrist, but they all describe figures who sound like what John meant. Over centuries, theologians merged these descriptions into a single composite character. Let's look at the pieces. The oldest piece comes from the book of Daniel, written around 167 BCE, during one of the darkest periods in Jewish history. The Seleucid Empire controlled Judea, and the Seleucid king, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, decided to erase Jewish identity. He outlawed Jewish religious practices, banned circumcision, burned Torah scrolls, and in 167 BCE, he did something so offensive, It became seared into Jewish memory. He sacrificed a pig on the altar of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Then he erected a statue of Zeus in the Holy of Holies. This event became known as the Abomination of Desolation. The book of Daniel contains apocalyptic visions that many scholars believe were coded references to Antiochus. In chapter 7, Daniel describes 4 beasts rising from the sea. The 4th beast has 10 horns, representing 10 kings. Then a little horn emerges among them. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. Daniel 7:8. Later, the vision is interpreted. He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law. Daniel 7:25. To the original Jewish readers, this little horn was Antiochus. But centuries later, Christian interpreters read these passages and saw something else, a prophecy about the future Antichrist, someone who would blaspheme God, persecute believers, and try to rewrite divine law. The pattern was set: an arrogant ruler, blasphemy, persecution, desecration of holy things. Fast forward 200 years. The Apostle Paul is writing to a young Christian community in Thessalonica around 50 to 60 CE. The believers are anxious. They think Jesus is going to return any day. Some have quit their jobs, believing the end is so near there's no point in working. Paul writes to correct them. Yes, Jesus is coming back. But not yet. Something has to happen first. Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. 2 Thessalonians 2:3-4. The man of lawlessness, the son of destruction, a figure who will sit in God's temple and declare himself divine. This sounds like what Daniel described, but Paul takes it further. This figure is empowered by Satan. The coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan with all power and false signs and wonders, and with all wicked deception. 2 Thessalonians 2:9-10. Now we have supernatural power added to the profile. Not just a tyrannical king, but someone performing miracles through demonic influence. Deceptions so convincing that even believers might be fooled. Paul also mentions something mysterious, a restrainer, someone or something holding this figure back. For 2,000 years, theologians have debated what this restrainer is. The Roman Empire, the Holy Spirit, the Church. We still don't know. But Paul's description gave early Christians a crucial detail. The Antichrist is being held back, for now. Then we get to the book of Revelation, written around 90 to 95 CE, probably during the reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian. The author, also named John, but probably not the same John who wrote the epistles, has a series of apocalyptic visions. In chapter 13, he sees a nightmare. And I saw a beast rising out of the sea, with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its heads. 10 horns. Sound familiar? This echoes Daniel's vision. The beast receives its power from the dragon, identified earlier in Revelation as Satan. It speaks blasphemies against God. It wages war on the saints and conquers them. It demands worship. And then, the famous passage, this calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Revelation 13:18, 666. the number that would haunt history. But Revelation never calls this figure the Antichrist. It's the beast. So why do Christians associate the beast with the Antichrist? Because the descriptions overlap. Both are empowered by Satan, blasphemous, persecutors of believers, deceivers, associated with the end times. Over time, these three figures, Daniel's little horn, Paul's man of lawlessness, and Revelation's beast, merged in the Christian imagination. They became one entity, the Antichrist. But here's what's fascinating. None of these original texts were thinking about a far future supervillain. Daniel was writing about a Greek king who died in 164 BCE. Paul might have been warning about a Roman emperor. Revelation's beast, as we'll see in the next chapter, was almost certainly a coded reference to the Emperor Nero and the persecution he unleashed on Christians. These were warnings about immediate threats, real dangers, flesh and blood tyrants. But once Christians started reading them as prophecies about a single future figure, the Antichrist stopped being a historical person and became a blank canvas, a template, a role waiting to be filled. And every generation since has found someone to cast in that role. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this, using my Audible link in the description is a massive, no-cost way to support the channel. You get a free 30-day trial, which includes 1 free audiobook credit, 2 if you're an Amazon Prime member, good for any premium title, and it's yours to keep forever, even if you cancel. If you're the kind of person who listens to 2-hour documentaries while doing other things, you're exactly who audiobooks were made for. This directly helps me keep making these deep dives. The link is right at the top of the description. Thank you. The Antichrist didn't begin with Christianity. The idea of a final enemy, a cosmic deceiver who would oppose God at the end of days, existed long before Jesus was born. And if you want to trace it to its source, you need to go to the caves. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed Dib was searching for a lost goat in the cliffs near the Dead Sea. He threw a stone into a cave opening and heard pottery shattering. Inside, he found clay jars containing ancient scrolls wrapped in linen. He'd stumbled onto one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Over the next decade, archaeologists found more than 900 manuscripts in 11 caves near the ruins of Qumran. The scrolls dated from around 300 BCE to 100 CE, making them 1,000 years older than any other known biblical manuscripts. They contained copies of Hebrew Bible texts, hymns, prayers, and community rules. And they revealed something crucial. Jewish apocalyptic thinking was already fully formed centuries before Christianity. The scrolls describe a cosmic war, not metaphorical, not symbolic, a literal, final battle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. And leading the forces of darkness was a figure called Belial. The word Belial appears in the Hebrew Bible, but it's usually translated as worthlessness or wickedness. It's not a name, it's a concept. Someone who acts with Belial is someone who acts without value, without morality, a scoundrel, a villain. But in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Belial transforms. He becomes personified, a being, a demon, the leader of evil itself. One of the most important texts is called The War of the Sons of Light Against the Sons of Darkness, also known as the War Scroll. Written sometime in the 1st century BCE, it describes a 40-year apocalyptic conflict. On one side, the Sons of Light, led by the Archangel Michael and aligned with God. On the other, the Sons of Darkness, led by Belial. Here's how the scroll describes Belial's role. For this shall be a time of salvation for the people of God, and a time of dominion for all the men of his forces. and eternal annihilation for all the forces of Belial. Belial isn't just an enemy, he's the anti-god. His forces include not just demons, but also foreign nations, corrupt priests, and anyone who opposes the community's strict interpretation of Jewish law. The War Scroll lays out battle formations, trumpet signals, prayers before combat. It reads like a military manual for the end of the world. Another text, the Damascus document, describes what it calls the three nets of Belial: fornication, wealth, and pollution of the sanctuary. Sound familiar? These are the same accusations Christians would later level against the Antichrist. Sexual corruption, love of money, and blasphemy against sacred spaces. The template was already there. But here's what makes Belial so important to our story. He's not described as acting alone in some distant future. The scrolls suggest Belial is active now, in the present. He's already deceiving people, already corrupting priests, already leading nations astray. The final battle is coming, yes, but the war has already started. This is exactly the same dual timeline thinking we saw in John's epistles. The spirit of Antichrist is already in the world, even as the Antichrist is still to come. Present and future, already and not yet. The Qumran community, probably Essenes, a strict Jewish sect, saw themselves as the remnant. The faithful few holding out against Belial's universal deception. They withdrew from mainstream Jewish society because they believed the temple in Jerusalem had been compromised. The priests were corrupt. The people had been led astray by Belial. There's a profound pessimism in these texts. The world isn't just flawed, it's been captured, occupied by demonic forces. Only divine intervention can fix it. Only God himself, arriving with angelic armies, can defeat Belial and establish true righteousness. Later Christian apocalyptic thought would inherit this entire framework. The idea that evil has a personality, a leader, a deceiver. The belief that the world is under enemy occupation, waiting for divine rescue. The conviction that a final cosmic battle will settle everything. Christians didn't invent the Antichrist. They inherited the blueprint from Jewish apocalyptic tradition, and they were about to give it a name. While Belial appears in texts written before Christianity, there's another figure in Jewish tradition that seems to emerge after Christianity, and possibly in response to it. His name is Armalus, and he's one of the strangest, most grotesque figures in medieval Jewish eschatology. Armalus first appears in a 7th century text called Sefer Zerubbabel, the Book of Zerubbabel. It's a bizarre apocalyptic vision attributed to Zerubbabel, the governor of Judah who oversaw the rebuilding of the Second Temple after the Babylonian exile. But the text was actually written 1,000 years later, sometime around 629 to 636 CE, possibly in response to the Byzantine-Sasanian Wars. The story goes like this. Armalus will be born in Rome, the enemy capital, the seat of power that destroyed Jerusalem and scattered the Jewish people. But his birth is unnatural, satanic. According to the text, Satan or Belial impregnates a marble statue of a beautiful virgin. The statue gives birth to Armalus, and he is hideous. The text describes him as deformed, with one eye larger than the other, one arm longer than the other, deaf in his right ear. Some versions say he has 2 heads. He is the anti-Messiah, the opposite of beauty and divine favor in every way. Armalus will gather an army and conquer the earth. He'll establish his rule in Jerusalem, a deliberate inversion of the true Messiah's reign. He'll wage war against the Jewish people, killing many, scattering others. At the height of his power, he'll face the true Messiah, either Messiah son of David or Messiah son of Joseph, and be destroyed. The parallels to Christian Antichrist tradition are unmistakable. A satanic birth, a false ruler claiming divine authority, a reign of terror centered in Jerusalem, a final confrontation with the true Anointed One. Even the name Armilus seems to be derived from either Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome, or perhaps as a cryptogram for Heraclius, the Byzantine emperor who briefly reconquered Jerusalem from the Persians in 629 CE. But here's the question scholars have debated for over a century. Did Armilus emerge from ancient Jewish apocalyptic traditions that Christians later borrowed? Or did Jewish writers develop the Armilus legend in response to hearing Christian Antichrist teachings? The evidence suggests the latter. Armilus doesn't appear in any pre-Christian Jewish texts. Not in Daniel, not in the Dead Sea Scrolls, not in the vast body of rabbinic literature from the first few centuries CE. He shows up suddenly in the 7th century, centuries after Christianity had spread extensively and developed its own Antichrist theology. Some scholars argue that Jewish communities, living under Christian Byzantine rule, heard Christian preachers talking about the Antichrist and thought, "We need our own version of that story. An enemy who opposes our Messiah, not theirs." The result was Armilus, a figure who shared the structure of Christian Antichrist lore, but was aimed at a different audience, serving a different theological purpose. Over time, the figure evolved. By the 11th century, texts like Midrash Vayosha were calling him Armilus ben Belial, Armilus, son of Belial. Now the medieval figure was explicitly linked back to the ancient enemy from the Dead Sea Scrolls. The lineage was complete. Belial had been personified in ancient texts, dormant for centuries in rabbinic thought, and then resurrected in a new form to combat Christian theological encroachment. Armilus never became as central to Judaism as the Antichrist became to Christianity. Rabbinic Judaism generally doesn't emphasize apocalyptic speculation the way Christianity does. But Armilus reveals something important. The idea of a final deceiver, a false messiah, an anti-anointed enemy was so powerful that it transcended religious boundaries. It moved from ancient Jewish sects to early Christians. Then it circled back, transformed into medieval Jewish thought. And later, as we'll see, it would migrate again, this time into Islam, where it would take the form of the Dajjal. The Antichrist wasn't owned by one faith. It was a shared nightmare, a template for ultimate evil that each tradition modified to fit its own theology, its own enemies, its own fears. Before Christianity gave this figure a name, Jews imagined Belial. After Christianity spread, Jews imagined Armilus. And both figures, ancient and medieval, would shape how Christians themselves came to understand their own Antichrist. The idea was always bigger than any single religion. It still is. But when early Christians named this ancient terror Antichrist, they would soon give it a face. And that face belonged to a Roman emperor. On the night of July 18th, 64 CE, a fire broke out in Rome. It started in the merchant stalls near the Circus Maximus, in the valley between the Palatine and Caelian hills. The shops were crammed with flammable goods, oil, timber, textiles. The flames spread quickly. A strong wind fanned the fire through the narrow streets and wooden tenements of the overcrowded city. The Great Fire of Rome burned for 6 days. When it finally stopped, 3 of Rome's 14 districts had been completely destroyed. 7 more were severely damaged. Thousands were homeless. Priceless temples, historic monuments, and irreplaceable records were gone. The heart of the empire was a smoking ruin, and the people wanted someone to blame. Rumors started almost immediately. Some said the emperor himself, Nero, had ordered the fire deliberately to clear land for his building projects. The story spread that Nero had watched the flames from his palace, playing his lyre and singing about the destruction of Troy. It was probably false. Nero was actually at his villa in Antium, 35 miles away, when the fire started. But the rumor stuck. Nero needed a scapegoat, and he found one in a strange new religious sect that most Romans barely understood: the Christians. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing about 50 years later, described what happened next. To suppress this rumor, Nero fabricated scapegoats and punished with every refinement the notoriously depraved Christians. First, Nero had self-acknowledged Christians arrested. Then, on their information, large numbers of others were condemned. Large numbers is an understatement. Christians were rounded up across the city, and Nero didn't just execute them. He turned their deaths into entertainment, into spectacle. Tacitus continues, "Their deaths were made farcical. Dressed in wild animals' skins, they were torn to pieces by dogs, or crucified, or made into torches to be ignited after dark as substitutes for daylight. Christians were covered in pitch and animal fat, tied to stakes in Nero's gardens, and set on fire. Human torches, burning through the night to light Nero's garden parties. Others were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by wild dogs in the arena, crucified along the Appian Way, fed to lions. Nero made their suffering a public spectacle, a grotesque form of imperial theatre. Among the victims, according to Christian tradition, were two of the faith's most important leaders, Peter and Paul. Peter was reportedly crucified upside down, at his own request, because he didn't consider himself worthy to die in the same manner as Jesus. Paul, a Roman citizen, was granted the more humane execution of beheading. The first generation of Christian leaders was being systematically wiped out. And here's what's crucial. Even Tacitus, no friend to Christians, he calls them notoriously depraved and their religion a deadly superstition, admits that Nero's cruelty backfired. Despite their guilt as Christians and the ruthless punishment it deserved, the victims were pitied, for it was felt that they were being destroyed, not for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty. Think about that. Romans who hated Christians still felt pity watching them burn alive. The executions were too cruel, even by Roman standards. And this is a civilization that routinely crucified criminals and staged gladiatorial death matches for entertainment. This was the context in which the Book of Revelation was written. Christians living under existential threat, their leaders dead, their communities hunted, and at the center of it all, the emperor who had burned them like candles. Is it any wonder they saw Nero as the ultimate enemy, the beast, the embodiment of Satan's power on earth? Now here's where it gets interesting. Nero didn't stop haunting Christians after his death. In fact, his legend only grew darker, because when Nero died in 68 CE, a rumor started spreading that would persist for centuries. He wasn't really dead. He would return. Now we get to the number, 666. Where does it come from? What does it mean? And why has it terrified people for 2,000 years? The answer is hidden in plain sight, in a single verse in the Book of Revelation. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. This calls for wisdom. In other words, this is a puzzle. You need to figure it out. Calculate the number of the beast. Not guess, not interpret. Calculate. Mathematics. There's a specific method involved. For it is the number of a man, not a demon, not a supernatural entity, a human being, a specific person. So how do you calculate a person's number? The answer is gematria, an ancient practice of assigning numerical values to letters. Hebrew and Greek didn't have separate number systems. They used letters as numbers. Aleph equals 1, Bet equals 2, and so on. Every word had a numerical value. You could add up the letters in someone's name and get their number. This wasn't mysticism, it was arithmetic. And in the 1st century, when Christians were being hunted and killed, gematria was also code, a way to criticize the emperor without writing his name. Graffiti in Pompeii shows how common this practice was. One inscription reads, "I love her whose number is 545. The number wasn't mystical, it was a love note in code. So when Revelation says, "Calculate the number of the beast," early Christians would have immediately understood, this is a coded name. Figure out who. Let's do the math. Take the name Nero Caesar, translate it into Greek, Neron Kaiser, then transliterate those Greek letters into Hebrew, because Hebrew gematria was the most common system. Each Hebrew letter has a numerical value. Nun equals 50, Resh equals 200, Vav equals 6, and so on. When you add up all 7 letters in Neron Kaiser, transliterated into Hebrew, you get exactly 666. Nero Caesar equals 666. But wait, there's more. Some ancient manuscripts of Revelation don't have 666. They have 616. For centuries, scholars thought this was a scribal error. Someone copying the text got the number wrong. Except it wasn't an error. It's actually proof that the Nero interpretation is correct. Here's why. If you spell Nero's name using the Latin spelling instead of the Greek, Nero Caesar instead of Neron Kaiser, you drop 1 letter in the Hebrew transliteration. That changes the total from 666 to 616. The scribal variant isn't an error, it's a translation choice. Greek-speaking Christians used one spelling and got 666. Latin-speaking Christians used another and got 616. Both numbers point to the same person, Nero. This is devastating evidence. It means the number of the beast wasn't some mystical prophecy about a future Antichrist. It was a coded identifier for a specific Roman emperor who was actively persecuting Christians at the time Revelation was written. Revelation wasn't predicting the future. It was speaking in code about the present. Think about the context. Christians couldn't openly call Nero the enemy of God. They'd be arrested and executed. So they spoke in symbols: the beast, the dragon, the number. To Roman authorities reading the text, it would seem like harmless religious fantasy. But to Christians, the message was clear. Nero is the beast. The emperor is Satan's instrument. Resist, endure. God will judge him. And resist they did. The code worked so well that nearly 2,000 years later, most people still don't know what 666 originally meant. But here's the strangest part. Once you know 666 equals Nero, you realize how easily the number could apply to almost anyone if you manipulate the gematria. Change the language, add a title, use a nickname. Suddenly, every tyrant, every pope, every politician can be forced to equal 666. Napoleon? Calculate his name a certain way, and you get 666. Hitler? Same thing. Ronald Reagan? His full name, Ronald Wilson Reagan, has 6 letters in each name. 666. Conspiracy theorists loved it. Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump. Every president has been accused of being the beast. And every accusation involves creative number manipulation. Because once you decide someone is the Antichrist, you can make the math work. But the original meaning was clear, precise, deliberate. 666 was Nero, the first Antichrist. And when he died, Christians thought the nightmare was over. They were wrong. In 68 CE, facing revolt from his own military and condemnation by the Roman Senate, Nero fled Rome. He ended up in a villa outside the city, surrounded by a handful of loyal servants. When he heard cavalry approaching to arrest him, he ordered a servant to kill him. The servant refused, so Nero tried to stab himself in the throat. He botched it. A secretary had to help him finish the job. His last words, according to the historian Suetonius, were, "What an artist the world is losing." Nero was dead. The beast was slain. Christians could breathe. Except the story didn't end there. Almost immediately, rumors began circulating that Nero wasn't actually dead, that he had faked his suicide and escaped, that he had fled east to Parthia, Rome's great rival empire, and was gathering an army, that he would return with Parthian forces, reconquer Rome, and unleash a reign of terror worse than anything he'd done before. This belief became known as Nero Redivivus, Nero reborn. And here's the strangest part. It lasted for centuries. Between 69 CE and the early 5th century, nearly 400 years, at least 3 impostors claimed to be Nero. All of them gained significant followings. One, in 69 CE, appeared in Greece and Asia Minor, playing the lyre and singing, just like Nero used to. He gathered enough support that Roman authorities had to hunt him down and kill him. Another appeared around 80 CE. This one made it all the way to Parthia and convinced the Parthian king that he was the real Nero. The king almost went to war with Rome over it. Diplomatic negotiations had to resolve the crisis. A third appeared around 88 to 89 CE. Again, Parthia got involved. Again, Rome had to deal with a political nightmare because people kept believing Nero was alive. Why did this myth have such staying power? Partly because Nero's body was never publicly displayed. He was cremated immediately in a private ceremony. No one outside his inner circle could confirm he was actually dead. In an age without photographs or forensic science, you had to take the government's word for it. And many people didn't trust the government. But there was something deeper. Nero had been so powerful, so terrifying, so larger than life, that people couldn't accept he was just gone. Tyrants that monstrous don't simply die quietly in a villa. They don't disappear. They come back. The Nero Redivivus legend gave form to a primal fear. The monster isn't dead. He's waiting. He's planning. And one day, he'll return, stronger, angrier, more dangerous. Now look at what the book of Revelation says about the beast. One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed. Revelation 13:3. As for the beast that was and is not, it is an eighth, but it belongs to the 7, and it goes to destruction. Revelation 17:11. The beast that was and is not existed, then didn't exist. Dead, but not dead. A leader who will return. This is Nero Redivivus in biblical code. Revelation wasn't just identifying Nero as the beast. It was responding to the myth that he would come back. The author was saying, yes, the beast seems to have been defeated, but don't be deceived. The enemy will return, or someone just like him will arise. This became one of the Antichrist's defining features. Not just that he's evil, but that he's recurrent. Every generation has one. He takes different forms, different names, but the spirit is the same. The enemy is immortal, even when individual tyrants die. The pattern was set here, with Nero. The first Antichrist didn't stay dead in Christian imagination, because the historical Nero didn't stay dead in Roman imagination. The myth fed the theology fed the myth, and both fed centuries of apocalyptic speculation. When medieval Christians looked for the Antichrist, they expected him to be a returning figure, someone who had been defeated before but came back. When modern Christians identify political leaders as the Antichrist, they're unconsciously echoing Nero Redivivus. This time, he's returned. Nero died in 68 CE, but Nero Redivivus, the idea that the ultimate tyrant never truly dies, he only waits, is still with us. Every time someone calculates a politician's name and gets 666, they're participating in a 2,000-year-old ritual. Every time a charismatic leader inspires both devotion and terror, someone whispers, "Is this the one?" Nero wasn't the Antichrist because of anything the biblical texts originally said. He became the Antichrist because early Christians, living under his persecution, reading coded texts, warning about beasts and dragons, made the connection. They cracked the code, they identified the enemy, and then they made a mistake. They universalized him. They turned a specific historical monster into a timeless template. They transformed Nero into an archetype that every civilization since has tried to fill. The man died. The myth lives on. And 2,000 years later, we're still calculating names, still looking for 666, still waiting for him to return. By the late 2nd century CE, Christians were assembling a profile. They had John's warnings about antichrists and the Antichrist. They had Daniel's little horn. They had Paul's man of lawlessness. They had Revelation's beast and the number 666. But who was the Antichrist? Where would he come from? Some of Christianity's earliest theologians found an answer in an unexpected place. An obscure prophecy about one of the 12 tribes of Israel, the tribe of Dan. In Genesis 49, the patriarch Jacob gathers his 12 sons and delivers deathbed prophecies about their descendant tribes. Most of the blessings are positive or neutral, but when he gets to Dan, something changes. Dan shall be a serpent by the way, a viper by the path, that bites the horse's heels so that his rider falls backward. Genesis 49:17. A serpent, a viper, an ambush predator. To ancient readers, this might have seemed like a reference to Dan's military cunning. But to early Christian theologians looking for clues about the Antichrist, this was more than metaphor. The serpent was Satan's form in Eden. If Dan's symbol was a serpent, maybe that meant something darker. Then they noticed something else. In Revelation 7, John has a vision of 144,000 people sealed from the 12 tribes of Israel. He lists all 12 tribes by name: Judah, Reuben, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, and so on. But Dan is missing. Why would one tribe be omitted from God's protection at the end times? The text doesn't explain, but it didn't need to. To theologians building a composite picture of the Antichrist, the absence was the explanation. Dan wasn't sealed because the Antichrist would come from Dan. You can't protect the tribe that produces the ultimate enemy. Irenaeus was among the first to make this connection explicit. It is said that the Antichrist is to spring from the tribe of Dan, and just as Christ came from Judah, so the Antichrist will come from Dan. A few decades later, Hippolytus of Rome elaborated in his treatise, On Christ and Antichrist. He wrote, "As the Christ was born of the tribe of Judah, so will the Antichrist be born of the tribe of Dan." This became standard Christian doctrine for over 1,000 years. Medieval artists depicted the Antichrist with Dan's tribal symbols. Theologians referenced it in sermons. The tribe that settled in northern Israel, that had struggled with idolatry in the time of the Judges, was now eternally marked as the source of ultimate evil. But here's the thing. There's no biblical text that explicitly says this. Genesis calls Dan a serpent, but it doesn't say, "And from you will come the Antichrist." Revelation omits Dan, but it doesn't explain why. The connection was inference, pattern recognition. Christians looking for answers in ancient texts and finding what they needed to find. They were building the Antichrist's biography from scraps, and once one detail was established, the rest fell into place. Since the Antichrist comes from Dan, he must be Jewish. If he's Jewish, he will likely claim to be the Messiah, which means he must rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, only to defile it. One assumption led to the next, until a complete narrative emerged. None of it was explicit in scripture, but by the medieval period, it was accepted fact. This is how the Antichrist evolved, not through divine revelation, but through centuries of theological speculation compounding into certainty. A serpent metaphor became a prophecy, an unexplained omission became proof, and an entire eschatological villain was constructed from hints and implications. The tribe of Dan never asked to be history's scapegoat, but once the label was applied, it stuck. In the mid-10th century, a Benedictine monk named Adso of Montier-en-Der received a request from Queen Gerberga of France. She wanted to know about the Antichrist. When would he come? What would he do? How would Christians recognize him? Adso wrote back with a letter that would become one of the most influential documents in medieval Christianity, De Ortu et Tempore Antichristi, on the origin and time of the Antichrist. Written around 950 CE, Adso's treatise synthesized centuries of speculation into a systematic biography. This wasn't theology, it was narrative, a complete life story of the ultimate villain, written as if it were already known history. According to Adso, the Antichrist will be born from the tribe of Dan, as theologians had long believed. But his conception will be unnatural. The devil won't directly father him. That would make him too divine, too powerful. Instead, the devil will enter the womb at the moment of conception, ensuring the child is marked by evil from the very beginning. He will be raised in Babylon or Bethsaida, depending on the version. Magicians and evil spirits will tutor him. He'll learn sorcery, deception, every form of wickedness. By the time he reaches adulthood, he'll be the perfect inversion of Christ. Then he'll come to Jerusalem. This is crucial to Adso's narrative. The Antichrist must rebuild the temple. He must sit in it. He must declare himself God. This fulfills Paul's prophecy in 2 Thessalonians. He takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. But Adso takes it further. The Antichrist will perform false miracles to deceive people. He'll make fire descend from heaven. He'll heal the sick. He'll raise the dead, or at least appear to, using demonic tricks. He'll convert kings and nations through signs and wonders. Most of the world will worship him. For 3.5 years, he will reign. This is the period Christians would later call the Great Tribulation. During this time, 2 prophets will return to oppose him, Elijah and Enoch. These 2 Old Testament figures, who according to tradition never died but were taken up to heaven, will come back to earth to preach against the Antichrist. He will kill them. Their bodies will lie in the streets of Jerusalem for 3.5 days. Then they'll rise from the dead, ascend to heaven, and the Antichrist's power will begin to crack. At the climax, the Antichrist will gather his armies on the Mount of Olives, the same place Jesus ascended to heaven. He'll prepare for a final confrontation with God, and then Christ will return. Or in some versions, the Archangel Michael will strike him down. Either way, the Antichrist will be destroyed. Not slowly, not through human effort, instantaneously, by divine power. Adso's letter became the standard text on the Antichrist for centuries. Monks copied it, preachers quoted it, scholars referenced it. By the 13th century, over 100 manuscript copies were in circulation. What's remarkable is how specific Adso was about things Scripture never mentions. The Bible doesn't say the Antichrist will rebuild the temple. It doesn't name Elijah and Enoch as his opponents. It doesn't specify the Mount of Olives as the site of his destruction. Adso filled in the gaps. And once those gaps were filled, they became fact. Medieval Christians didn't read Adso's letter as speculation. They read it as prophetic truth. The Antichrist biography was set. All that remained was for history to produce the man who fit the description. And throughout the Middle Ages, plenty of candidates emerged. On February 22nd, 1240, Pope Gregory IX sent a letter to the rulers of Christian Europe. The letter had a simple message. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II was the Antichrist. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. The Pope declared that Frederick was literally the beast from Revelation, the man of lawlessness, the enemy prophesied to appear at the end of days. This wasn't a theological debate. It was a political weapon. Frederick II of Hohenstaufen was one of the most powerful rulers in medieval Europe. He controlled the Holy Roman Empire, Sicily, parts of Italy, and had claims to Jerusalem through the Crusades. He spoke 6 languages. He patronized science, philosophy, and the arts. He was called Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. He was also in direct conflict with the Pope. The struggle between Frederick and the papacy was about power. Who ruled Christendom, emperors or popes? Who had ultimate authority, the crown or the church? This wasn't new. Popes and emperors had been fighting for centuries. But Frederick took it further. He challenged papal authority openly. He taxed church lands. He appointed bishops without papal approval. He treated the Pope as a political rival, not a spiritual superior. So Gregory fought back with the most powerful accusation available: Antichrist. The papal propaganda was vicious. Frederick was accused of calling Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad the 3 great deceivers of mankind. Whether he actually said this is debated by historians. It sounds suspiciously like something his enemies would want him to have said. But true or not, the label stuck. He was accused of atheism, of sorcery, of keeping a harem, of being in league with Muslims. Every vice, every heresy, every moral failing was attributed to him, and the apocalyptic imagery was deployed in full force. Frederick was the beast rising from the sea. He was the dragon. He was the little horn. The papal letters describe him in the same terms Adso used for the Antichrist: deceiver, blasphemer, persecutor of the saints. Frederick responded in kind. He called the Pope a false prophet. He suggested the papacy itself was corrupt beyond redemption. His supporters argued that if anyone was the Antichrist, it was the Pope, not the Emperor. This is the first time we see Antichrist accusations flying in both directions. What's crucial here is that neither side was talking about the far future. They weren't speculating about end times prophecy. They were using the Antichrist as a tool in a present tense political war. The accusation wasn't, he might be the Antichrist someday. It was, he is the Antichrist now, and you need to oppose him. Frederick II died in 1250. He was not, as it turns out, the Antichrist. The world did not end. Christ did not return. The apocalypse was postponed. But the accusation set a precedent. Once the label had been used as a political weapon, it would be used again, and again, and again. Popes would call emperors the Antichrist. Emperors would call popes the Antichrist. Reformers would call the church the Antichrist. Defenders of the church would call reformers antichrists. The term stopped being a theological concept and became rhetorical ammunition. And here's the thing. It worked. Calling someone the Antichrist wasn't just an insult. It was delegitimization. It was dehumanization. It said, this person is not just wrong. They're evil incarnate. They're the enemy of God himself. You don't negotiate with the Antichrist. You destroy him. The Antichrist had been weaponized. By 1250, this accusation was a standard political tool within the borders of Europe. But this internal fracturing was only possible because a much older, external precedent had already been set. To find the source of this civilizational rivalry, we have to rewind 6 centuries to a moment when a new power emerged from the Arabian Peninsula, one that would force Christendom to redefine itself through a shared, apocalyptic enemy. In the centuries following Muhammad's death in 632 CE, Islam spread with astonishing speed. Within 100 years, Muslim armies had conquered territories from Spain to India, Christian lands, North Africa, the Middle East, parts of Europe, fell under Islamic rule. Medieval Europe struggled to make sense of this. How could a new religion emerge so quickly? How could it defeat Christian armies? How could so many people convert? The answer many Christians arrived at: Muhammad must be a false prophet, a tool of Satan, possibly the Antichrist himself. Medieval Christian polemics against Muhammad were brutal. He was called a sorcerer, a heretic, a servant of demons. His visions weren't divine revelation, they were demonic possession or epileptic seizures. The Quran wasn't scripture, it was deception designed to lead souls to hell. Some claimed Muhammad died in the year 666. This was almost certainly false. Most historical sources place his death in 632 CE, but the symbolism was too perfect to resist. If 666 was the number of the beast, and Muhammad died in 666, then obviously he was connected to the Antichrist. The math didn't need to be accurate. It needed to be convincing. John of Damascus, writing in the 8th century, was one of the earliest Christian theologians to systematically critique Islam. He called it a heresy rather than a separate religion. To him, Muhammad was a false prophet who had corrupted Christian and Jewish teachings, mixed them with pagan Arab traditions, and created a dangerous hybrid faith. But the most famous medieval depiction of Muhammad comes from Dante's Divine Comedy, written in the early 14th century. In the Inferno, Dante places Muhammad in the 9th ditch of the 8th circle of hell, Malabouge, the realm of fraud. Specifically, among the sowers of discord. These are people who caused schism, division, religious conflict. And Dante's description is graphic. It's an eternal punishment designed to match his crime. He divided the unified truth of Christianity, so he's eternally divided himself. Interestingly, Dante treats Saladin, the Muslim general who recaptured Jerusalem during the Crusades, with far more respect. Saladin is placed in limbo among the virtuous pagans, not punished, just not saved. But Muhammad is tortured forever. This wasn't theology, it was propaganda. The Crusades required a narrative. If Christian knights were going to march thousands of miles to kill Muslims and reclaim Jerusalem, they needed to believe those Muslims were agents of ultimate evil. They needed to believe Islam was satanic. They needed to believe Muhammad was the Antichrist, or his forerunner. And so the accusation was made, repeatedly, in sermons, in chronicles, in art. Most medieval Christians had never read the Quran. They didn't speak Arabic. They had no first-hand knowledge of Islamic theology, but they didn't need it. They already knew what they believed. Islam was the enemy. Muhammad was the deceiver, and the Antichrist was somehow involved. Why did medieval Christians need Muhammad to be the Antichrist? Because empires define themselves by their enemies. Christianity in the medieval period wasn't just a religion, it was the foundation of European identity. To be European was to be Christian. To be Christian was to oppose Islam. The two were inseparable. When Islam expanded into formerly Christian territories, it wasn't just a military threat, it was an existential one. If Christianity was the true faith, why was it losing? If God favored Christians, why were Muslims winning battles? If the Pope represented Christ on earth, why couldn't he stop the advance of the infidels? These were uncomfortable questions. The Antichrist accusation solved them. If Muhammad was the Antichrist, or at least a precursor to him, then Islam's success made sense. This was the prophesied deception, the false signs and wonders, the seduction of nations. It wasn't that Christianity was weak, it's that the end times were unfolding exactly as predicted. It reframed defeat as prophecy, and it gave Christian Europe a clear identity. We are the faithful remnant. We are the ones holding out against the Antichrist's forces. We are the defenders of truth in a world being deceived. This is how interreligious polemic functions as identity formation. You don't just oppose the other side, you define yourself through that opposition. The enemy becomes necessary. Without Islam to fight against, what would medieval Christendom be? United? Hardly. European Christians spent centuries fighting each other. But when they needed unity, when they needed purpose, they had Islam. The same logic applied in reverse. Islamic scholars wrote polemics against Christianity. They argued that Christians had corrupted the original message of Jesus, that the Trinity was polytheism, that the Church had strayed from monotheism. And in Islamic eschatology, a figure emerged who mirrored the Christian Antichrist, the Dajjal. Two religions, two civilizations, two versions of the ultimate deceiver. Each side convinced they were fighting the forces of evil. Each side convinced the other was led by the Antichrist. And both sides were wrong. Or maybe both sides were right, but not about theology. They were right that they needed an enemy. Civilizations always do. The Antichrist, whether Christian or Islamic, wasn't a prophecy waiting to be fulfilled. It was a narrative tool, a way to make sense of conflict, a way to justify violence, a way to unite people against a common threat. Medieval Christians didn't hate Muslims because Muhammad was the Antichrist. They called Muhammad the Antichrist because they already hated Muslims. The accusation came after the conflict, not before. While medieval Christians were accusing Muhammad of being the Antichrist, Muslims were developing their own eschatological villain, Al-Masih ad-Dajjal, the false Messiah. And here's what's remarkable. The Dajjal doesn't appear in the Quran. The Quran mentions the Day of Judgment. It describes signs of the end times. It warns about deceivers and false prophets. But it never names the Dajjal. He exists only in the Hadith, the collected sayings and traditions attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, compiled in the centuries after his death. This is significant. The Hadith traditions developed during the same period when Christianity and Islam were in direct conflict. The same period when Christians were accusing Muhammad of being the Antichrist. And the Dajjal who emerges from these texts bears an unmistakable resemblance to the Christian Antichrist. According to the Hadith, the Dajjal will be blind in one eye. His good eye will bulge out like a grape. The Arabic word kafir, unbeliever, will be written on his forehead, visible to all Muslims, but invisible to non-believers. He will claim to be a prophet. Then he will claim to be God. He will perform false miracles. He'll make rain fall. He'll command the earth to bring forth crops. He'll appear to heal the sick and raise the dead. Though these will be demonic illusions, not true resurrection. He will travel the entire earth spreading deception. But there are two places he cannot enter, Mecca and Medina. Angels guard these holy cities. The Dajjal's power ends at their gates. His reign will last 40 days, though one day will be like a year, another like a month, another like a week, and the rest like normal days. Islamic scholars have debated what this means for centuries. Is it literal, symbolic, a reference to the perception of time during crisis? At the height of the Dajjal's power, Jesus, in Arabic, Isa, will return, not as a prophet this time, but as a warrior. Islamic eschatology teaches that Jesus didn't die on the cross. He was taken up to heaven and will return at the end of days to fight the Dajjal. Working alongside Jesus will be the Mahdi, the guided one, a righteous leader who will unite Muslims and prepare the way for the final battle. Together, Jesus and the Mahdi will confront the Dajjal, and Jesus will kill him. Some traditions say he'll strike him down at the gate of Lod in present-day Israel. Others say it'll be in Damascus. But the outcome is the same. The deceiver dies, the faithful are vindicated, and the day of judgment follows. The parallels are undeniable. A final deceiver who claims divine authority, false miracles that seduce nations, a limited period of reign, a confrontation with the true Messiah, destruction by divine intervention. Three faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all developed versions of the same enemy: Jewish Belial, Christian Antichrist, Islamic Dajjal. They emerged in sequence. Jewish apocalyptic texts described Belial centuries before Christ. Christian texts described the Antichrist in the 1st century. Islamic texts described the Dajjal in the 7th to 9th centuries. Each tradition borrowed from the one before. Each adapted the concept to fit its own theology, and each used it to define itself against external threats. The Dajjal wasn't just a warning about the end times. He was a way to explain why non-Muslims rejected Islam. Why would people refuse the truth of the Quran? Because they'd been deceived by the Dajjal. Why would Christians and Jews oppose Muhammad's message? Because the Dajjal's influence had already begun. Just as Christians used the Antichrist to explain Islam's success, Muslims used the Dajjal to explain Christianity's persistence. The template was too useful to belong to one faith. It migrated, it evolved, it adapted, and in every version, the message was the same. There is an ultimate enemy. He is coming. He will deceive almost everyone. Only the faithful will recognize him. Only the faithful will resist. It's the same nightmare, just spoken in different languages. On October 31st, 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed 95 theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. He was challenging the Catholic Church's sale of indulgences, payments that supposedly reduced time in purgatory. It was an academic dispute, a call for debate. Luther wasn't trying to start a revolution. He wasn't trying to split Christianity. But within a few years, Luther would declare the Pope to be the Antichrist, and he would mean it literally. Luther's transformation wasn't immediate. Early in his career, he revered the papacy. He believed the Pope was Christ's representative on earth. He trusted the Church's authority. But the more Luther studied Scripture, the more he saw a gap between what the Bible taught and what the Church practiced. Salvation by grace through faith, not through works, not through payments, not through priestly mediation. The Bible alone as ultimate authority, not tradition, not papal decrees. When Luther challenged these practices, the Church didn't reform, it doubled down. Pope Leo X issued a papal bull condemning Luther's teachings. Luther was excommunicated. His writings were burned. And Luther's response was to burn the papal bull publicly and declare that the Pope was the Antichrist. Not a servant of the Antichrist, not a corrupt leader, the Antichrist himself. In his writings, Luther laid out the case. The Antichrist exalts himself above God. The Pope claims authority over Scripture, over kings, over salvation itself. The Antichrist sits in God's temple. The Pope sits in the Church, claiming to speak for God. The Antichrist deceives through false signs. The Catholic Church offers relics, miracles, visions, all designed to lead people away from Scripture. The Antichrist persecutes true believers. The Church burns heretics, including those who translate the Bible into common languages. Luther's conclusion: we are certain that the papacy is the seat of the true and real Antichrist. I have almost completely satisfied myself that the Pope is the Antichrist prophesied by Scripture in the last days. This wasn't rhetorical exaggeration. Luther genuinely believed he was living in the end times. He thought the Reformation was the final battle between God's truth and Satan's deception. He expected Christ to return soon, and he wasn't alone. Protestant reformers across Europe reached the same conclusion. John Calvin, John Knox, John Wesley, all identified the papacy as the Antichrist. It became foundational Protestant doctrine. Visual propaganda spread the message. Woodcuts depicted the Pope with devils whispering in his ear. Illustrations showed him wearing crowns, while Christ wears thorns. Charts aligned the beast of Revelation with the structure of the Catholic Church. 7 heads, 7 hills of Rome, 7 sacraments. The Council of Trent, the Catholic Church's response to the Reformation, was seen as proof. Instead of reforming, the Church reaffirmed every doctrine Protestants opposed: purgatory, indulgences, papal authority, the veneration of saints. To Protestants, this confirmed everything. The Church refused to submit to Scripture. It refused to acknowledge error. It insisted on traditions that had no biblical basis. Only the Antichrist would behave this way. The accusations went both directions. Catholics called Luther the Antichrist. They called Calvin the Antichrist. They produced their own woodcuts, showing Protestant reformers as demons, as servants of Satan, as agents of the beast. Europe descended into religious war. The 30 Years' War killed millions. The English Civil War pitted Protestant against Catholic. France saw massacres. Germany was devastated. And through it all, each side was convinced they were fighting the Antichrist. The Antichrist wasn't a future threat anymore. He was here. He was the enemy across the battlefield. He was the neighbor who worshipped differently. He was the theologian who interpreted Scripture the wrong way. The accusation had been fully weaponized. The identification of the Pope as the Antichrist became so foundational to Protestant identity that it was written into confessional statements, official declarations of belief that defined denominations. The Westminster Confession of 1646, a cornerstone document for Presbyterian and Reformed churches, stated explicitly, "There is no other head of the Church but the Lord Jesus Christ, nor can the Pope of Rome, in any sense, be head thereof, but is that Antichrist, that man of sin and son of perdition, that exalts himself in the Church against Christ." The Smalcald Articles, written by Luther in 1537, declared, "The Pope is the very Antichrist, who has exalted himself above and opposed himself against Christ." These weren't fringe opinions. They were official doctrine. If you were a Protestant in the 16th and 17th centuries, believing the Pope was the Antichrist wasn't optional. It was part of what it meant to be Protestant. This belief shaped politics. Protestant nations viewed Catholic nations as agents of the Antichrist. England's conflict with Spain was eschatological. The Spanish Armada in 1588 was the beast rising from the sea. The belief shaped culture. Protestant literature, art, sermons, and hymns reinforced the message. John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, one of the most influential books in Protestant history, depicts the Pope and his agents as enemies of the faithful pilgrim. And the belief persisted for centuries. Even into the 20th century, some Protestant denominations maintained the official position that the Pope is the Antichrist. The Seventh-day Adventist Church, founded in the 19th century, still teaches this as core doctrine. They identify the papacy as the little horn of Daniel, the beast of Revelation, and the Antichrist of 2 Thessalonians. Most mainstream Protestant denominations have quietly dropped or softened the language. Ecumenical movements in the 20th century made it awkward to call the leader of 1 billion Christians the embodiment of ultimate evil. The Second Vatican Council in the 1960s open dialogue between Catholics and Protestants. Cooperation replaced condemnation. But the legacy remains. Protestant identity was forged in opposition to Rome. The Reformation was about defining a new kind of Christian community, and part of that definition required an enemy. The Antichrist was a boundary marker: us versus them, truth versus deception, light versus darkness. The irony is that this made Protestantism the mirror image of what it opposed. Catholics had used the Antichrist accusation against emperors and political enemies. Protestants used it against the Pope. Both sides claimed to be defending truth. Both sides claimed divine authority. Both sides were willing to kill for their interpretation of Scripture. The Antichrist accusation didn't unify Christianity. It fragmented it. And here's the uncomfortable truth: it worked. Protestantism as a movement needed the papacy to be the Antichrist. Without that enemy, what held Protestants together? Theological differences between Lutheran, Reformed, Anglican, Baptist, and other traditions were significant. They disagreed on baptism, communion, church structure, predestination, but they all agreed on one thing: the Pope was the Antichrist. That shared enemy created shared identity. It's the same pattern we saw with medieval Christianity and Islam. Define yourself by your enemy. Unite against a common threat. Survival through opposition. The Antichrist, once again, was less about prophecy and more about politics. Less about the end of the world and more about the present struggle for power, authority, and legitimacy. The accusation was a tool, and like any tool, it worked because people believed it was something more. In the early 19th century, as Napoleon Bonaparte conquered most of Europe, Christians across the continent became convinced they were living in the end times. And Napoleon was the Antichrist. The evidence seemed overwhelming. He was a tyrant who crowned himself emperor, rejecting divine authority. He conquered nations, redrew borders, and brought kings to their knees. He seemed unstoppable, invincible, beyond human. And then there was the math. His name could be manipulated to equal 666, depending on which language, title, or spelling variation you used. The calculations worked because people wanted them to work. But the most significant reason Christians identified Napoleon as the Antichrist wasn't mathematical. It was political. Napoleon threatened the old order. He overthrew monarchies. He spread revolutionary ideals: liberty, equality, fraternity. He weakened the Catholic Church's power, seized church property, and placed priests under state control. To defenders of traditional authority, Napoleon wasn't just a military threat. He was a spiritual one. The Russian Orthodox Church officially declared Napoleon the Antichrist. Interestingly, one of the accusations was that he didn't persecute Jews. In old Russia, tolerance of Judaism was seen as evidence of Antichrist sympathy, because the Antichrist was prophesied to emerge from Jewish lineage and rebuild the temple. When Leo Tolstoy wrote War and Peace in the 1860s, decades after Napoleon's death, he opened the novel with Russian aristocrats discussing whether Napoleon was the Antichrist. This wasn't a fringe belief. It was mainstream enough to be the starting point for one of literature's greatest works. Napoleon died in exile in 1821. The world didn't end. Christ didn't return. The prophecy failed. But the lesson wasn't learned. Within a generation, new candidates emerged. If any modern figure seemed designed to fulfill Antichrist prophecy, it was Adolf Hitler, a dictator who demanded absolute loyalty, a charismatic leader who deceived millions, a persecutor of God's people, the Jews, a man who waged war against the entire world and nearly won. In the 1930s and 1940s, Evangelical scholars and preachers identified Hitler as the beast from Revelation. Some identified Mussolini as the false prophet, the second beast who supports the first. The Axis powers seem to align perfectly with end times prophecy. Hitler's rise matched the pattern, a leader emerging from chaos, offering solutions, gathering power, demanding worship. Nazi rallies looked like religious ceremonies. The salutes, the chanting, the devotion. It wasn't hard to see echoes of Revelation 13. They worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it?" The Holocaust made the connection even stronger. The Antichrist was prophesied to persecute the saints and wage war against God's people. 6 million Jews murdered, millions more dead in concentration camps. If this wasn't the work of ultimate evil, what was? But then Hitler died in 1945. The Third Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, collapsed after 12. The world continued. Christ didn't return, and the prophecy failed. Evangelical leaders quietly stopped talking about Hitler as the Antichrist. Some reframed him as a type of the Antichrist, a preview, but not the real thing. Others simply moved on to the next candidate. But here's what's important. While Hitler was alive, the identification wasn't speculation. It was certainty. Sermons proclaimed it. Books detailed it. Prophecy charts mapped it out. And when the certainty proved wrong, there was no reckoning, no questioning of the method, no examination of how pattern recognition and fear had produced false confidence. Instead, the search continued. Because if Hitler wasn't the Antichrist, someone else must be. After World War II, the Antichrist hunt shifted focus. During the Cold War, some evangelicals identified Soviet leaders as potential antichrists. Mikhail Gorbachev became a favorite candidate in the 1980s. His birthmark, a prominent stain on his forehead, was called the Mark of the Beast. Books were published. Prophecy conferences discussed it. For a brief moment, Gorbachev was the leading Antichrist candidate. Then, the Soviet Union collapsed. Gorbachev faded from power. The apocalypse didn't arrive. The Gulf War in 1991 produced a new candidate, Saddam Hussein. Saddam ruled Iraq. Iraq was ancient Babylon. The Book of Revelation describes Babylon as the seat of the beast's power. Saddam even undertook restoration projects on the ruins of ancient Babylon, inscribing his name on bricks, just like Nebuchadnezzar had done millennia earlier. He styled himself as the heir to Babylonian glory. Evangelical prophecy teachers connected the dots. The Euphrates River, mentioned in Revelation, flows through Iraq. Saddam's invasion of Kuwait was framed as the beginning of the final conflict. Some predicted the Gulf War would escalate into Armageddon. It didn't. Saddam was deposed in 2003 and executed in 2006. Christ didn't return. Then came the 21st century, and the accusations accelerated. Barack Obama was called the Antichrist by politically motivated Christians. His charisma, his global appeal, his message of hope and change. To his opponents, these weren't just campaign slogans. They were signs of deception. Websites calculated his name to equal 666. Videos claimed he was Muslim, foreign-born, un-American. Anything to paint him as the ultimate outsider, the infiltrator, the false messiah. When Donald Trump was elected, the accusations reversed. Now Trump was the Antichrist. His authoritarianism, his lies, his ego, his divisiveness. Progressive Christians applied the same apocalyptic language conservatives had used against Obama. Neither was the Antichrist. Both presidencies ended peacefully. The world continued. But the accusations themselves reveal something important. The Antichrist isn't about theology anymore. It's about politics. It's a weapon. You call your enemy the Antichrist to delegitimize them, to rally your side, to reframe political conflict as cosmic warfare. It's the same tactic medieval popes used against emperors, the same tactic Protestants used against Catholics, the same tactic Christians used against Muslims. The pattern is consistent. Identify the threat, apply the label, reframe political or cultural anxiety as cosmic battle. It's been 2,000 years, dozens of candidates, hundreds of failed predictions, and still the hunt continues. Because the Antichrist isn't a person waiting to appear. He's an idea that keeps getting reimagined, a template we project onto our enemies, a narrative tool to make sense of threats we don't fully understand. The Antichrist has always been a mirror. He reflects back whatever a culture fears most. For early Christians under Roman persecution, it was the emperor who burned them alive. For medieval Christians threatened by Islam, it was Muhammad. For Protestants breaking from Rome, it was the Pope. And as technology accelerates, the mirror finds new reflections. As long as humans have fear, they'll have an Antichrist. And as long as they have an Antichrist, they'll keep finding new people to accuse. On October 22nd, 1844, thousands of Christians across America prepared for the end of the world. They were followers of William Miller, a Baptist preacher who had spent years calculating biblical prophecies and determining the exact date of Christ's return. Miller studied the book of Daniel, specifically the prophecy of 2,300 days in Daniel 8:14. Treating each day as a year, a common interpretive method, he calculated that the cleansing of the sanctuary, which he equated with Christ's second coming, would occur in 1843. When 1843 passed without incident, Miller recalculated. The new date, October 22nd, 1844. Believers sold their possessions. Farmers left crops unharvested. Families gathered in churches and hilltops, dressed in white robes, waiting for Jesus to appear in the clouds. And nothing happened. The sun rose, the day passed, night fell. Christ did not return. This event became known as the Great Disappointment. Testimonies from Millerites describe the crushing aftermath. One follower wrote, "I waited all through Tuesday, and dear Jesus did not come. I waited all the forenoon of Wednesday, and was well in body as I ever was. But after noon, I began to feel faint, and before dark, I needed someone to help me up to my chamber, as my natural strength was leaving me very fast, and I lay prostrate for 2 days without any pain, sick with disappointment." Another wrote, "Our fondest hopes and expectations were blasted, and such a spirit of weeping came over us as I never experienced before. It seemed that the loss of all earthly friends could have been no comparison. We wept and wept till the day dawned." Some abandoned their faith entirely, others doubled down. A smaller group reorganized, reinterpreted the prophecy, and concluded that something had happened on October 22nd, 1844, just not what they expected. Christ had entered the heavenly sanctuary to begin a final phase of judgment, not returned to earth. This reinterpretation became the foundation of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which still exists today with over 20 million members worldwide. But the broader lesson was ignored. Date setting is dangerous. Certainty about the end times leads to devastation when the end doesn't come. And yet, the pattern repeated. The Jehovah's Witnesses have predicted the end of the world multiple times. Their founder, Charles Taze Russell, calculated that Christ's invisible return and the beginning of the last days would occur in 1874. When that passed without visible change, the organization reinterpreted it as a spiritual event, invisible to human eyes. Then they predicted 1914 as the year when God's kingdom would fully establish itself on earth. World War I erupted in 1914, which seemed to confirm the prophecy. The witnesses taught that the war was the beginning of the final tribulation, but the war ended. The world continued, so the date was revised. 1918, then 1925, then 1975. Each time, followers were encouraged to prepare. Each time, publications implied or outright stated that the end was imminent. And each time, when the prophecy failed, the organization quietly moved on. Former Jehovah's Witnesses have described the psychological toll. Imagine structuring your entire life around the belief that the world will end in a specific year. You don't pursue higher education. Why bother? You don't save for retirement. You won't need it. You don't make long-term plans. Then the date passes, and you're left with nothing. The organization's response was typically to blame those who had read too much into the predictions or to reframe the failed prophecy as a test of faith. But the pattern reveals something important. Apocalyptic movements need urgency. The end has to be soon, or the movement loses momentum. If Christ is returning in 1,000 years, why sacrifice now? Why evangelize with desperation? Why live as if every day might be your last? The imminent end is the engine that drives the movement. So when the end doesn't come, you don't abandon the timeline. You adjust it. You push it forward just enough to keep hope alive, just enough to keep believers committed. It's not dishonesty, it's survival. Because without the end times, what's left? For 5 centuries before the Millerites, before the Jehovah's Witnesses, before modern date setters, the Antichrist wasn't just preached, he was painted, carved, illustrated, and some of history's greatest artists gave him a face that still haunts us. In the small Italian city of Orvieto, there's a cathedral with a chapel that contains some of the most disturbing religious art ever created. Between 1499 and 1502, the Renaissance painter Luca Signorelli covered the walls of the San Brizio chapel with frescoes depicting the end of the world. And the centerpiece of this apocalyptic vision is the Antichrist. Signorelli's Antichrist doesn't look like a monster. He looks like Christ. That's the point. In the fresco titled "The Preaching of the Antichrist," the deceiver stands on a pedestal, preaching to a crowd. He's handsome, charismatic, surrounded by followers. But if you look closely, you see the devil standing behind him, whispering into his ear, puppeteering him. The Antichrist's words aren't his own, they're Satan's. In the crowd, Signorelli painted real people, historical figures, even himself, watching skeptically from the corner, dressed in black, alongside the fresco's patron. The message is clear. The Antichrist doesn't announce himself as evil. He appears as good, as righteous, as divinely inspired, and only those paying close attention will notice the devil pulling the strings. Signorelli's work captured the Renaissance understanding of the Antichrist. Not a grotesque monster, but a perfect counterfeit. The ultimate deception is beauty masking corruption. This was revolutionary. Medieval depictions of the Antichrist often showed him as physically deformed, horns, scales, bestial features. But Signorelli understood the theological point. The Antichrist's power lies in how normal he appears. The frescoes also depict the Antichrist's eventual defeat. In another panel, the Archangel Michael casts him into hell. Order is restored. Good triumphs. But the image that haunts visitors is the preaching scene, because it forces the question: if the Antichrist looks like Christ, how do you tell them apart? Signorelli's answer: you can't. Not by appearance. Only by paying attention. Only by discernment. It's a warning that resonates beyond theology. Beware charismatic leaders. Question those who claim divine authority. Don't trust appearances. The Orvieto frescoes have been visited by millions over the past 5 centuries, and the Antichrist's face, calm, confident, convincing, remains one of art history's most unsettling images. In 1498, the German artist Albrecht Dürer published a series of 15 woodcuts illustrating the Book of Revelation. Dürer's Apocalypse series became one of the most influential visual interpretations of the end times ever created. The images were mass-produced, affordable, and widely distributed. For many Europeans who couldn't read, Dürer's woodcuts were their primary exposure to biblical prophecy, and they were terrifying. Dürer's depictions of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, the 7-headed beast, and the whore of Babylon were rendered in stark black and white with meticulous detail. The compositions were chaotic, violent, overwhelming. His beast from Revelation 13 is a 7-headed dragon, each head crowned, rising from turbulent waters. Human figures fall beneath its claws. The sky is filled with divine judgment. There's no safety, no escape. Dürer's Antichrist, the beast, is not human. It's monstrous. This was the late medieval view. The Antichrist might start as a man, but would be revealed as something fundamentally other, something demonic. What makes Dürer's work significant is its timing. The woodcuts were published just before the Reformation. Within 2 decades, Luther would declare the Pope the Antichrist, and Europe would descend into religious war. Dürer's images gave people a visual vocabulary for the apocalypse. When preachers warned about the Antichrist, congregations could picture Dürer's beast. When pamphlets accused the Pope of being the Antichrist, artists could borrow Dürer's compositions. The woodcuts weren't neutral illustrations. They shaped how people understood prophecy. They made abstract biblical passages concrete. They turned theological concepts into nightmares you could see. Dürer's work demonstrates the power of visual media to influence belief. A well-crafted image can do what 1,000 sermons cannot: bypass rational analysis and speak directly to fear. And once an image lodges in cultural memory, it becomes part of how a society imagines the future. For centuries after Dürer, depictions of the Antichrist echoed his style. The 7-headed beast, the crowned horns, the chaos. Art didn't just reflect theology, it shaped it. In 1976, a horror film changed how the world imagined the Antichrist. The Omen told the story of Damien Thorne, a young boy adopted by an American diplomat. Damien seems normal, charming even, but he's actually the son of Satan, destined to become the Antichrist. The film wasn't subtle. Damien has 666 birthmarks under his hair. A sinister nanny protects him. People who discover his identity die in elaborate accidents. And at the climax, his adoptive father realizes the horrifying truth. The child he loves is the embodiment of evil. The Omen became a massive cultural phenomenon. It spawned sequels, a remake, and countless imitators. But more importantly, it embedded a specific vision of the Antichrist into popular consciousness. The Antichrist as a child, innocent-looking, raised by unsuspecting parents, hidden in plain sight. This was different from medieval depictions or Reformation accusations. The Antichrist wasn't a foreign emperor or a corrupt pope. He was domestic, suburban, American. The horror wasn't that evil was coming from outside. It was that evil was already here, wearing a child's face. The Omen tapped into Cold War-era anxieties, fear of infiltration, fear that threats could emerge from within, not just from Soviet enemies abroad, fear that you couldn't trust appearances, and it made the Antichrist entertaining. Before the Omen, the Antichrist was primarily a theological concept. After the Omen, he was a movie villain, a character, a plot device. The film's success demonstrated something important. Apocalyptic narratives sell. They tap into primal fears. They offer clear heroes and villains. They promise ultimate stakes, not just personal danger, but cosmic significance. Hollywood learned the lesson. In the decades since, the Antichrist and end times themes have appeared in dozens of films and TV shows, some serious, most campy, but all reinforcing the same cultural familiarity. The Antichrist is coming, and he'll look normal. In 1995, authors Tim LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins published Left Behind, the first book in a series that would become a cultural juggernaut. The series depicts the rapture, the sudden disappearance of all true Christians, and the 7-year tribulation that follows. The Antichrist, a charismatic Romanian politician named Nicolae Carpathia, rises to power, deceives the world, and establishes a brutal global dictatorship. The Left Behind series sold over 65 million copies. It spawned films, video games, and a merchandising empire. For millions of evangelical Christians, Left Behind wasn't fiction. It was prophecy in novel form, a preview of the future. The series popularized dispensationalist theology, a specific interpretation of end times prophecy developed in the 19th century. According to this view, history is divided into distinct periods, or dispensations. We're currently in the church age, which will end with the rapture. Then comes the tribulation, when the Antichrist reigns. Then Christ returns to establish a 1,000-year kingdom. Left Behind made this complex theology accessible. Readers didn't need to study Daniel or Revelation. They could just follow Nicolae Carpathia's rise and understand the entire eschatological timeline. But the series also had a darker effect. It normalized fear. Readers were encouraged to see current events through an apocalyptic lens. Every international treaty was a step toward one world government. Every charismatic leader was a potential antichrist. Every technological advancement was a precursor to the mark of the beast. The Left Behind phenomenon created an entire industry: prophecy conferences, YouTube channels, books analyzing current events for prophetic significance. A whole ecosystem built on the premise that the end is near, and the Antichrist was at the center of it all. Nicolae Carpathia became the template, a charming globalist politician who promises peace but delivers tyranny. Someone who manipulates media, controls technology, and demands worship. For readers of Left Behind, the message was clear. The Antichrist is coming. He'll look good, he'll sound convincing, and most people will follow him. Only the faithful remnant will resist. It's the same message Christians have been telling themselves for 2,000 years. But now it's a best-selling novel, and that makes it feel more real. The rapture is one of the most popular concepts in modern evangelical Christianity. It's also relatively new. The idea was developed in the 1830s by John Nelson Darby, an Irish Anglican priest who broke away to join the Plymouth Brethren movement. Darby studied biblical prophecy and came to a revolutionary conclusion. God has two separate plans, one for Israel, one for the church. According to Darby's system, God's prophetic timeline was paused when Israel rejected Jesus as Messiah. The church age, a parenthetical period not mentioned in Old Testament prophecy, began. When the church age ends, the prophetic clock will resume. Israel will take center stage again, and the events of Daniel and Revelation will unfold. But Christians won't be here for it. They'll be raptured, taken up to heaven before the tribulation begins. This was a radical departure from traditional Christian eschatology. For 18 centuries, Christians believed they would go through tribulation, not escape it. Suffering was expected. Persecution was promised. The idea that believers would be whisked away before things got bad was novel, but it was comforting. Darby's system, called dispensationalism, divided history into 7 distinct periods, each with different rules for salvation and different relationships between God and humanity. We're currently in the 6th dispensation, the Church Age. The 7th will be the millennium, Christ's 1,000-year reign on earth. Darby traveled extensively, teaching his system in Britain, America, and Canada. His ideas spread through Bible conferences, publications, and personal influence. And then an American lawyer got involved. In 1909, Oxford University Press published the Schofield Reference Bible. This wasn't just a Bible translation. It was the King James Bible with extensive notes, cross-references, and commentary written by Cyrus Schofield, an American lawyer-turned-pastor who had embraced Darby's dispensationalist theology. The Schofield Reference Bible became one of the most influential books in American Protestant history. It sold millions of copies. For generations of evangelical Christians, Schofield's notes were treated as almost as authoritative as Scripture itself. And embedded in those notes was dispensationalism, the rapture, the 7-year tribulation, the Antichrist as a future world dictator, the rebuilding of the Jewish temple, the Battle of Armageddon. What Darby had developed as a theological system, Schofield packaged as biblical truth. Here's what made the Schofield Reference Bible so effective. The notes appeared on the same page as the biblical text. Readers didn't see them as interpretation. They saw them as explanation. When they read Revelation 13 about the beast, Schofield's note told them this was the Antichrist, a future political leader who would rule the world during the tribulation. The line between scripture and commentary blurred. For millions of readers, dispensationalism wasn't one interpretation among many. It was what the Bible taught. Period. The Schofield Reference Bible shaped American evangelicalism more than almost any other book. It influenced how pastors preached, how prophecy teachers taught, how believers understood current events, and it created an entire worldview. History is moving toward a climax. The Antichrist is coming. Israel's restoration is a prophetic sign. Technology is paving the way for the mark of the beast. Wars and rumors of wars prove we're in the last days. Dispensationalism gave believers a lens to interpret everything. And once you see the world through that lens, every headline becomes prophetic. Every crisis becomes a sign. The end is always near, because the system requires it to be. On June 26, 1974, a pack of Wrigley's Juicy Fruit gum became the first product to be scanned using a barcode at a supermarket checkout. Within weeks, some Christians were calling barcodes the mark of the beast. The reasoning: barcodes contain 3 sets of longer lines that mark the beginning, middle, and end of the code. These lines correspond to the number 6 in the barcode system. 3 sixes, 6, 6, 6. This interpretation was technically wrong. The guard bars don't actually represent numbers. But accuracy didn't matter. The symbolism was too perfect to ignore. Then came credit cards, then ATM cards, then RFID chips, then biometric scanners. Each new technology sparked fresh apocalyptic panic. In 1982, a book titled The New Money System 666 predicted that a global cashless economy was being established to prepare for the Antichrist's reign. The author warned that every financial transaction would soon require a number, and anyone who refused the number would be unable to buy or sell. It hasn't happened. Decades later, cash still exists, but the fear persists. When Sweden began moving toward a cashless society in the 2010s, prophecy teachers pointed to it as proof. When China implemented social credit systems, it was called a beta test for the mark. When payment companies introduced chip implants for employees, tiny RFID chips inserted under the skin for convenience, the warnings intensified. Each technological advancement is interpreted through revelation. It causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark. The text is clear. A mark will be required for commerce, and in a digital age, that prophecy seems more plausible than ever. But here's the problem. Christians have been identifying the mark of the beast for centuries. It's been credit cards, barcodes, social security numbers, national ID cards, vaccine passports, and cryptocurrency. Every generation finds its mark. Every generation is convinced this time is different, and every generation has been wrong. In 1991, Tim Berners-Lee created the World Wide Web. Within a few years, prophecy teachers were warning that the internet was the infrastructure Satan would use to control the world. The reasoning made sense. Revelation describes the Antichrist establishing a global government. How could one person control the entire world? Through communication technology, through surveillance, through interconnected systems that track every transaction, every movement, every thought. The internet made global control technically feasible for the first time in history. When Edward Snowden revealed the extent of NSA surveillance in 2013, prophecy teachers said, "See? We told you. The infrastructure is already in place. The Antichrist just needs to take control of it." Every technological advancement is framed as a step toward the mark. Smartphones track your location. Social media monitors your behavior. Search engines know your thoughts before you finish typing. AI predicts your actions. Facial recognition identifies you in a crowd. These aren't evil in themselves, but in the hands of the Antichrist, they become tools of totalitarian oppression. The fear is understandable. Technology has enabled unprecedented surveillance. Governments do track citizens. Corporations do collect massive amounts of data. Privacy is eroding faster than most people realize. In March 2020, Bill Gates did a Reddit AMA, Ask Me Anything. Someone asked about coronavirus response. Gates mentioned the possibility of digital certificates to track who had been vaccinated. Within days, conspiracy theories exploded online. Bill Gates wants to microchip everyone. The vaccines contain tracking devices. This is the mark of the beast. Gates is the Antichrist. Never mind that microchips can't fit through vaccine needles. Never mind that they'd need power sources and antennas to transmit data. Never mind that Gates was talking about digital records, not physical implants. The fear made sense on an emotional level. Technology is advancing faster than most people can comprehend. When a billionaire tech figure talks about certificates and tracking, the apocalyptic alarm bells ring. Bill Gates became the latest in a long line of Antichrist candidates. Not because of anything he actually did or said, but because he represents a type of power that feels alien and threatening. But attributing these developments to end times prophecy does something dangerous. It frames technological issues as spiritual warfare instead of political problems. If barcodes are the mark of the beast, you can't regulate them. You have to resist them. If the internet is Satan's tool, you can't reform it. You have to reject it or prepare for martyrdom. This mindset removes agency. It makes Christians passive observers of prophecy instead of active participants in shaping society's relationship with technology. And it creates a cycle where every innovation is viewed with suspicion, not because it's actually harmful, but because it might be prophetic. The result? Believers spend more time calculating whether the latest tech is the mark of the beast than they do asking whether it's just or equitable or safe. Prophecy becomes a distraction from ethics. In 2017, an anonymous user on the website 4chan began posting cryptic messages claiming to have high-level government clearance. The user, known as Q, alleged that Donald Trump was secretly fighting a global cabal of Satan worship. who controlled world governments, media, and financial institutions. This conspiracy theory, known as QAnon, spread rapidly through social media, and at its core was a familiar narrative. An evil conspiracy is deceiving the world. A righteous leader is fighting them. A final confrontation is coming. It's the Antichrist story, just rebranded. QAnon believers didn't explicitly call the cabal the Antichrist, but the structure was identical. A hidden enemy controlling world events, a global deception, a spiritual battle dressed in political language. And for many QAnon followers who were also evangelical Christians, the connection was explicit. They believed the deep state cabal was preparing the way for the Antichrist. That figures like George Soros, Bill Gates, and Hillary Clinton were either the Antichrist or his agents. The conspiracy merged with traditional end times prophecy. COVID-19 vaccines became the mark of the beast. 5G towers were tools of surveillance. The World Economic Forum was establishing the Antichrist's one world government. QAnon demonstrates how apocalyptic thinking adapts to new contexts. The template remains. Ultimate evil is organizing. Most people are deceived. Only the awakened few can see the truth. It's the same message Christians have believed for 2,000 years, just with different villains. And like all Antichrist accusations throughout history, it functions as political ammunition. If your opponents aren't just wrong, they're literally agents of Satan, then compromise is impossible. Dialogue is futile. The only option is total victory or total defeat. QAnon made the apocalypse contemporary, and in doing so, it revealed how deeply Antichrist thinking is embedded in Western culture. You don't need to believe in biblical prophecy to think like an apocalypticist. You just need an enemy, a conspiracy, and the conviction that you're part of the faithful remnant fighting ultimate evil. Humans are pattern recognition machines. We're hardwired to find connections, even when they don't exist. This is an evolutionary advantage. Our ancestors who saw patterns, footprints in the mud, mean predator nearby, survived. Those who didn't recognize patterns became prey. But this same mechanism creates problems when applied to prophecy. We see what we want to see. When you're looking for the Antichrist, you'll find him. You'll connect dots that aren't actually connected. You'll interpret ambiguous events as confirmations. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. We notice evidence that supports our beliefs and ignore evidence that contradicts them. Example: you believe the Antichrist is rising. A charismatic leader gains power. You notice he's persuasive, he's gathering followers, he's making promises that sound too good to be true. But you don't notice dozens of other leaders are doing the same thing. Most politicians are charismatic. Most promise change. These aren't unique traits. They're standard political behavior. But because you're primed to see the Antichrist, ordinary political maneuvering looks apocalyptic. This is compounded by another cognitive bias, the availability heuristic. We judge the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind. If you've been hearing about the Antichrist your whole life, the concept is highly available. So when you encounter someone who fits even part of the description, your brain says, this might be it. Prophecy belief creates a feedback loop. First, you're taught the Antichrist is coming soon. So you look for signs, and you find things that could be signs, because you're actively looking. Each sign reinforces your belief that the end is near, so you look even harder for more signs, and the cycle continues. This isn't stupidity, it's how human cognition works. We all do this with different beliefs. Prophecy believers just do it with eschatology. But there's more to the psychology. The Antichrist becomes a lens that makes the world coherent. It explains why bad things happen. The Antichrist's forces are at work. It explains why good people suffer. They're resisting the deception. It explains why history feels chaotic. We're approaching the climax. Remove the Antichrist, and suddenly you need new explanations. Messier ones, less satisfying ones. So the hunt continues, not because there's evidence, but because the alternative, meaningless, is unbearable. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The traits Christians attribute to the Antichrist are just the traits of authoritarians. Charismatic leadership, promises of security and prosperity, demands for absolute loyalty, control of information, persecution of dissenters, cult of personality. These aren't supernatural, they're human, and they happen regularly throughout history. Hitler wasn't the Antichrist. He was a fascist demagogue who exploited economic crisis and nationalist resentment. Stalin wasn't the Antichrist. He was a totalitarian dictator who used state terror to maintain power. The danger of focusing on the Antichrist is that it makes believers look for supernatural signs instead of recognizing human patterns. When you're watching for someone who performs false miracles, you might miss someone who's simply lying effectively. When you're calculating whether a name equals 666, you might ignore actual authoritarian policies. The Antichrist framework is a distraction. Real authoritarianism doesn't announce itself with apocalyptic signs. It creeps in gradually, through propaganda, through erosion of democratic norms, through vilification of enemies, through appeals to fear. And Christians, trained to look for the Antichrist in dramatic supernatural terms, often fail to recognize authoritarianism in its mundane forms. Worse, some actively support authoritarians, as long as those authoritarians claim to defend Christian values. Because the Antichrist is supposed to come from outside the faith. He's supposed to oppose Christianity openly. So when a leader claims to be Christian, waves a Bible, appeals to traditional values, he can't be the Antichrist. He's on our side. This is how believers align themselves with the very authoritarianism they claim to oppose. They're so focused on a future supernatural threat that they embrace present human threats. The real danger was never a singular Antichrist figure. It was systems of oppression. It was dehumanization of enemies. It was concentration of power without accountability. And those things don't require prophecy to recognize. They just require paying attention. 2,000 years of predictions, dozens of candidates, hundreds of failed prophecies. At what point do we consider that maybe the problem isn't the timing, it's the entire framework? What if there is no singular Antichrist waiting to appear? Perhaps Revelation wasn't predicting a far future global dictator, but describing the Roman persecution early Christians were actually experiencing. Maybe Paul's man of lawlessness was a first-century threat, not a future one. It is possible that the entire composite figure, assembled from Daniel, Paul, Revelation, and centuries of speculation, is a theological construction, not a prophetic certainty. This isn't a comfortable question for believers who've structured their worldview around the Antichrist's imminent arrival, but it's worth asking. Because when you let go of the Antichrist, the world looks different. You stop looking for cosmic enemies and start recognizing human ones. You stop interpreting every political development as a sign and start engaging with it as politics. Instead of delegitimizing opponents as demonic, you have to treat them as human beings with different views. You stop waiting to be rescued by divine intervention and start taking responsibility for making the world better now. The Antichrist framework offers certainty, but it's a false certainty, and it comes at a cost. Wasted energy on failed predictions, damaged credibility when prophecies fail, political extremism justified by apocalyptic thinking, and passivity disguised as faithfulness. What if, instead of searching for the Antichrist, Christians focused on the teachings of Christ? Love your enemies, care for the poor, pursue justice, make peace. Not because the end is near, but because these things are good. The Antichrist has been a distraction, a convenient villain, a way to avoid the harder work of confronting actual evil, the kind that doesn't announce itself with supernatural signs. Maybe it's time to stop looking for the Antichrist and start looking at ourselves.